Hello, everyone. My name is Tim Pryal, and I'm the Executive Director of the university's President's Business Council and a member of the class of 1989. I hope that you and your families are all doing well during these unique and challenging times. Thank you for joining us for our webinar, our inaugural PBC webinar with keynote remarks. We're excited with our launch into the webinar format as a way of offering opportunities to engage with our alumni, parents, and friends while sharing keynote remarks on the experiences and areas of expertise of members of our broader University of Scranton community. While the current COVID-19 pandemic presents an opportune time for webinars, we look forward to growing and continuing with our webinar programming, even when we get back to gathering for in-person networking receptions. I want to thank our university president, Father Scott Pillars, our PBC chair, Frank Pern, and University Advancement Vice President Tom McKinnon for their continued support of our PBC initiatives. Before we move along in the program, allow me to do some housekeeping by pointing out a few features of the Zoom webinar platform that we will be using for our webinar and highlight some of the difference between the Zoom webinar format and the Zoom meeting platform, of which many of us have become more familiar in the past 2 months. We will be utilizing two features for today's webinar. The first is the chat feature. Chat is being utilized for technical difficulties only. If you are experiencing a technical difficulty or technical issue within the webinar, please send us a message via the chat option and we will try to resolve this as best as we can. The second is the Q&A feature. After Jim's presentation, we will open the discussion. So please feel free to submit your questions during the entire webinar. You have the option to submit your question anonymously if you wish, and questions will only be viewed by the host and not by all the attendees. Both of these features can be found at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please note one major difference between Zoom webinar and Zoom meeting is that webinar does not offer the ability of our attendees to view all the other participants either with their video on or just their name in a box. Finally, please know that this webinar is being recorded for later use and will be available via our webpage. Now I'd like to introduce our PBC chair and ask him to offer us a welcome and an introduction to Father Pillars. Member of the class of 1983 and a parent of a graduate of the class of 2016, and we are hoping to add the class of 2024 to that list. Frank Pern is a Global Chief Compliance Officer at JP Morgan Chase in New York City. Frank was a member of the university's Board of Trustees from 2006 to 2015, serving as Vice Chair of the Board and Chair of the Board's Finance Committee. He has been a member of the President's Business Council since inception in 2001, and in 2015, Frank was awarded the university's President's Medal at the PBC's annual award dinner. We are grateful for his longstanding, tireless, and generous commitment to the university. Frank.
Tim, thank you very much. I'm really glad to be here. It's great to see you, Sarah, Jerry, and Father Pillars, albeit on a tiny little screen here. These times are unprecedented, as we all know, and I think it's a wonderful opportunity for us to get together, albeit on a webinar, to just spend a few minutes taking a break from our hectic day-to-day, break from our work and our emails and our Zoom meetings. It is really amazing how quickly Zoom has become a verb, right? We Zoom bomb, we Zoom webinar, we Zoom meet. It's just, I think, another example of just how resilient we are as a group, and we figure out how to get things done. So this is another example of the university and all of us, thinking of different ways to stay together as a community. Over 170 people so far have joined the meeting tonight, which I think is fantastic. Tim and Tom and I are going to talk about maybe we do these all the time now rather than trying to drag you into New York City or Philadelphia. But we're really pleased tonight to have Dr. Cummings with us. His expertise couldn't be more appropriate for our first webinar and today's events. A graduate of the university, Jim will share some information, some slides and his experiences that I know we'll find extremely, extremely valuable. I'm glad that my partner and vice chair of the PBC, Elizabeth Madden, continues to work closely with Tim and I and the team at focusing on continuing to build out our philanthropic, our students' experience and internships and mentoring through the PBC. Going on near 20 years, it's been a fabulous creation of Kip and a number of other senior leaders 2 decades ago. And it's really important for us to continue that. And I ask all of you to stay and or get involved. It is incredibly important for the university. One of the best things about being around the university and these alumni activities is to get to talk to Father Pillars, listen to what he's got going on at the university, what he's got going on in life. So I'm very, very pleased and honored to introduce Father Pillars, our university president, to speak a little bit about what's going on, a little bit of his views and thoughts, and then turn it over to our guest speaker. So with that, Father Pillars, please.
Oh, there you go. Okay, a little technical difficulty here, I guess. Frank, thanks very, very much for being with us tonight, and even more for your leadership over decades at the university. You are the quintessential University of Scranton alum in terms of your generosity and your affection for the university. It goes without saying that this has been an uneasy season for all of us, in particular those of us who work in higher education, to try to imagine a way forward. We're doing that. We're doing it very well and very deliberately with a great deal of discernment behind our movement forward. I have to say that I've never been prouder or more fortunate to be part of the University of Scranton community than I am right now. Everybody, students, faculty, staff, they've risen to the occasion in ways that I would never, ever have imagined. The generosity of spirit here is overwhelming to me. And every day I get emails from alums and from current students and parents encouraging us to be who we are. And we will never let that be frayed by any situation, and certainly not this one. So we're trying to move forward. We are moving forward together. And this is a time to say to you very honestly, the University of Scranton needs you now more than ever. And I would ask you seriously to keep us in your prayers. And I promise to keep all of our alumni, our friends and their families in my prayers, that we weather this journey into the unknown together. And we could not be in a better place tonight than to have Jim with us. Jim is a member of a family that has deep roots here in Scranton. I think his dad graduated in 1952, and many members of his family, uncles, cousins, have all gone through here. In fact, his sister is on our theology faculty now, and that's a tough spot to be. Imagine being in a classroom trying to explain to undergraduates why bad things happen to good people. It's a quintessential theological question. So we wish her well, and I'm really thrilled to have Jim with us. You know, he's been a good friend to the university despite the incredible busyness of his life. And we are very fortunate to have him tonight to ask and, again, answer some of our questions about exactly what is happening right now. There's so many conflicting sources of information, it's hard to follow. So we are very, very blessed to have Jim with us tonight. So without any further ado, let me turn this over back to Tim, I believe.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Father. Thanks for being with us tonight. On behalf of all of us at the university and the entire university community, I want to thank you for the leadership, and you referenced it in your comments, but the great care and caution that you're using in these decisions, keeping safety a top priority, but most importantly, keeping our students at the center of all that you're doing. So we greatly appreciate your leadership, even more so today than at any other time. I'm going to offer a brief introduction to Jim Cummings. Jim is unfortunately not able to join us via video, so we have him hooked up via phone, and I'm going to operate the slideshow deck that he's put together for us. But let me give you a little brief introduction of the keynote speaker. I'm not going to read his full bio, as that would require its own webinar in and of itself. That's why when we initially sent out the invitation, we included Jim's bio so that you can take a look at that yourself. But let me give you a few highlights. Jim is a native of Dunmore, Pennsylvania. Dr. Cummings is a graduate of Bishop O'Hara High School, now Holy Cross High School. He graduated from the University of Scranton in 1988 with a bachelor's degree in biology. I'll give a shout out to a number of Jim's 1988 classmates who are on the webinar with us. And I also want to give a shout out to many of Jim's family members that join us. Once the invitation, I guess, got circulated in the Cummings clan, many of them stepped up, and we appreciate them being with us tonight to maybe hear some opportunity of Jim speaking a little differently than he might around the family dinner table. Following his graduation from Georgetown University School of Medicine, Jim spent 26 years in the U.S. Army, retiring with the rank of colonel. Jim is the president of Icon Government and Public Health Solutions, Incorporated. He is a member of the university's Medical Alumni Council and has attended and presented at many of their medical symposiums. He is a regular attendee at our annual PBC networking reception in Washington, D.C., and frequently mentors university students who are pursuing their own medical careers. I can speak specifically. I know there's at least one student on the call, on the webinar, who Jim has recently spoken to, and she is currently a student at the Georgetown Medical School herself. Jim would normally be on a short list of potential webinar keynotes, but there was no better person for us to start with as we launch our PBC webinars during a global pandemic. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Jim Cummings. Hello, Jim.
Yes, Tim.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen. We'll get your PowerPoint up. Right now we are on the title slide. So you are live whenever you're ready.
Okay. Hey, thanks a lot, Tim. And thanks, Father Pillars, our university president, and Frank Pern, our PBC president, for having me on tonight and letting me talk to all my friends and colleagues at the PBC and the great class of '88 and others in terms of outbreaks, responses, and where we're at with COVID-19. You already know that I'm a member of the great class of '88 and that great Jesuit base that I developed at Scranton. I further fostered at Georgetown University, and then later continuing to be a person for others and letting my light shine in the U.S. military for 26 glorious years. After that great career as an infectious diseases physician and paratrooper, I went on to be a vice president of emerging infectious diseases for a vaccine company in the commercial sector, and now run a contract research organization that does government and public health and global health solutions globally. With that, let's move to the slides. The disclaimer slide, Tim. So for tonight's talk, Chatham House rules apply for the presentation. The ideas that I'll discuss in this talk, they're my own, right? Not representative of any company, government, or any other group. I own them. All of the items that will be brought up are open source and unclassified. And I have no official conflicts of interest here. I don't have stock in any company whose products might be being developed, but I do run a CRO, and I am pro-global health and pro-vaccines. So through that lens, I'll give a short review. Next slide. The agenda, we'll have a brief history of pandemics and recoveries. We'll talk about COVID-19, just how did we get here? We'll look at some potential pathways forward, some solutions that I think are in development are important. And what are we learning now to help us deal with those future pandemics, epidemics, and outbreaks? And then I think at 1:45, we'll stop for some questions and answers, and looking forward to it. Slide. So, looking historically for recent outbreaks, pandemics, and recoveries, everyone focuses right now in the media on the 1918 influenza pandemic. Most people might call it the Spanish flu. That's a bit of a misnomer, and that we know it likely didn't start in Spain. Whether it came from East Asia or Europe, or maybe even Kansas, as troops went over in support of the Great War, World War I, we know it didn't start in Spain, but because Spain was somewhat neutral, they did not have a dog in the fight in terms of keeping the wraps on that outbreak occurring in their country. That said, I mentioned this occurred during World War I. That was 16 million people who died in World War I of battlefield injuries. The flu took 50 million lives. That was about 1/5 of the world population reported at the time. The death rate was really high. And this is the first flu that they'd seen in a while that attacked not just the elderly and the young and the infirm, but this had a very bad effect in terms of mortality rate on those young, hale, hardy people who normally could brush off an infection and not feel that they may not have even had any symptoms. We think now, looking back at this flu, this was because of a cytokine storm that occurred. People's immune systems went crazy when they got this infection. And if you were relatively well and had a healthy immune system, there was a lot more immune system to go pretty crazy. We'll forward up to 1968, the pandemic flu, sometimes called the Asian flu. That's an H3N2 flu, a type of influenza A strain. And during that outbreak, there were 1 million people worldwide who died, 100,000 in the United States. Now, we continue to see H3N2 as seasonal influenza globally, even today. A vaccine was developed against this flu, right? So in 1918, no vaccines, sorry. 1968, we had flu vaccines ongoing. We developed a flu vaccine for H3N2 pandemic flu, but it came out a little late. It wasn't available until after the outbreak. So really not of high utility during the current outbreak in 1968, but afterward. And even today, we still give some semblance of H3N2 influenza vaccine. I include HIV/AIDS only because in recent history, it's been just the most outrageous pandemic. It's covered the globe. It's affected so many people, and horrific numbers, especially between 2005 and 2012 when it was at its peak of transmission. SARS is an outbreak. Really, we noticed it in Asia coming out in February of 2003. It spread pretty quickly to 24 countries. Over 700 people died. The interesting thing on that particular outbreak in 2003, right? By 2003, we had the internet, right? We had sharing of information. We had good scientific sharing. And the scientific community really came together quickly to share that information. And because of that, and because of a little luck, we were able to thwart the spread of that particular outbreak, and that was short-lived. That's sudden acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus, so one of the beta coronaviruses. Ebola, we've seen 2 recent outbreaks, 2014 to 2016, in Western Africa. Over 28,000 people were infected, with over 15,000 who perished. So close to a 10,000 survival rate. And then a secondary outbreak in 2018 in the Democratic Republic of Congo. We learned some things from that particular outbreak as well. We very much accelerated our product development platforms to come up with solutions for Ebola. But we also took a look at our reporting mechanisms, our diagnostics, our logistics train in terms of how do we get products to where they need to be? How do we get protective measures into the hands of the people who need to use them? You know, being full glove and gowned and masked, et cetera, it's one thing even if you can get those masks in a lab in Pennsylvania or here in Washington. It's quite another thing to do that in a very arduous environment where the temperature goes up to 115 degrees ambient. It makes it somewhat difficult. But again, some lessons learned in Ebola, and luckily both of those outbreaks had tempered out. MERS-CoV, was first reported being seen in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in 2012. It actually reared its head a little bit earlier in the Kingdom of Jordan, in some hospital workers there, 14 hospital workers. And that Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome coronavirus, also a beta coronavirus, had its start as the beta coronaviruses do, likely in a bat, then transferred to the camel population, and then to the human population with respiratory exposure. As I mentioned, the death rate in those who were symptomatically infected, we noticed 35%. The issue there is our diagnostics for MERS-CoV weren't the best. There was a lot of cross-reactivity with that particular coronavirus. The populations in the Middle East, somewhat difficult to get large-scale screening, et cetera, and we'll talk a little bit about screening when it comes to SARS-CoV-2. So MERS itself sort of petered out, but certainly had some spread in the Republic of South Korea as well. And now we look at SARS-CoV-2. That's the virus that is responsible for COVID-19. And really, I guess the recovery and response we'll talk about throughout the rest of this lecture, but that's the most recent or current pandemic we're dealing with. I mentioned, slide Tim, that we've done a lot of learning through all of these outbreaks, and we do a lot of continued planning and learning even when there's not an outbreak occurring. So across a whole of government, and not just the US government, but other governments as well, NGOs, non-government organizations, academic institutions, commercial biopharmaceutical companies, CROs like the one I run at ICOM, and others, we get together very regularly to discuss and learn from what we call disease X. That's the next pathogen, generally considered to be likely a viral pathogen that will be infecting humanity, and it could be responsible for an outbreak or a pandemic. And there's references at the end of this talk. Tim and the PBC will send them out to you, because there's a dearth, I think, of consistent information out there. If you just start Googling things, those references, I think you can take them to heart as good, solid stuff. But in that reference list, there are the proceedings of this meeting that occurred at the Trudeau Institute in upstate New York, where in a whole of government, DOD, HHS, Health and Human Services, both the CDC and the NIH and BARDA, many vaccine and therapeutic and diagnostic manufacturers, academics, and others got together to discuss, where we were at the time and where we need to be in terms of being able to adapt and respond to these upcoming outbreaks. Again, it's not if another outbreak's going to occur, even after we get our hands around this one. It's just when. It's, I guess, part of the new normal. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that. Slide. So SARS-CoV-2, or COVID-19 causing virus, I mentioned it's a beta coronavirus. And the beta coronaviruses are generally seen in bat reservoirs, right? If you look to the left in the picture, there's a yellow arrow pointing to the glycoprotein spike that is surrounding this virus body or this viral capsid. That spike, if you do a cross-section, it looks somewhat like a crown or the corona of the sun. And that's what gives this particular virus its name. But it's also what allows these viruses to attach to human cells. So if you have an idea of what that GP spike looks like, and you can train your immune system to go after that spike, your immune system will be able to identify and destroy that virus, and hopefully also block it from entering your cells. I mentioned that we look at these beta coronaviruses as likely coming from a bat reservoir. This is almost the easiest slide for anyone who teaches out there to teach to, because there's so much about this virus we still don't know. Right? We know that it likely originated in Wuhan in the Hubei province in China. And because they do have wet markets there, and these bats are sold for food in the wet markets, that's likely the transition point into the human chain, whether through an intermediary or directly from bat. We know that most of the infection we consider by respiratory droplets. That's why, and you'll see on some of the upcoming slides, the whole idea of using a cloth mask to cover your mouth to prevent transmission to others should you sneeze or cough, etc. But, could it be spread in other mechanisms? We'll go over that in just a moment. Some of the questions I fielded regard the period of infectivity. When can I stop or know that I wouldn't give this to my children, my elderly relatives, my colleagues at work? Well, the likelihood is your infectivity starts prior to showing any symptoms. Some carriers would be asymptomatic throughout the disease, we think. There are some people who now test positive for the antibodies without having registered a thought of having a symptomatic disease in the recent past. But we know that they can spread that viral infection. How long does it last? Well, we're not quite sure. Right? There's some studies going on now as part of this response effort, looking at the natural history of these infections, trying to gather more actionable information about this virus. We know that people who are hospitalized, it looks like they stay in the hospital a little longer than people with other respiratory infections. And if they require ventilator support, they may be on the ventilator a little longer, right? That's with supportive care. There's good news on the horizon there. Some of the questions also are only the elderly and ill at risk. I think early on in the presentation of COVID-19 here in the Americas, there was a misconception that it's only the elderly that really are at risk, and people can go about their daily business. Some folks even plan to, if they could, get exposed to this virus so they could then develop immunity and not have to worry about it at a future time. All those preconceived misgivings have been blown out of the water. I can tell you that from the death rate that we'll see in just a moment, it's not only the elderly or those who are medically compromised, who are ill in the hospital, on ventilators, or who are dead. This certainly has a concentration in elderly or medically compromised, but it crosses the spectrum of humanity in terms of who it's affecting directly. Slide. So the infectious process, the CDC, which is a good resource for information, would say to maintain a 6-foot distance to prevent the spread of COVID-19. There's some logic to this. There's some good numbers and math behind it. We know that for your average sneeze, these droplets shouldn't necessarily travel to direct persons past the 6-foot mark, can they? They can. But again, we're looking at numbers and saying, how can we mitigate this risk to a good extent? And that's a 6-foot distance radius. As this cartoon demonstrates, this turbulent gas cloud can prolong the droplets in liquid form. And, it rises because warmer air, it's warmer than ambient air, and can settle down in other places. So if one weren't to cover their mouth when they sneezed or coughed vigorously, you could technically get a spread of viral droplets past the 6-foot mark. When we say, respiratory droplets and the need for social distancing, that's where that 6-foot distance piece comes in. But there is, concern that it could be smaller sized particles that are being expressed in an airborne route. And, again, data not 100% on that, more to follow. Are there non-respiratory sources in humans? There are. We know we've been able to find this virus in stool, in ocular fluid, and there's some concern about blood. I can tell you that BARDA right now is developing techniques to sterilize blood or clean blood if it were to occur. But currently, there's no data to suggest that the blood supply is tainted in any way. And there's no data to suggest that there's a fecal-oral transmission cycle to this. Still a good methodology or reason to wash your hands, though. Surface contamination and duration. A lot of times folks will ask, how long will this last on my counterboard or on the groceries I'm bringing in? And I think there's been a lot of demonstrations in the general media about this. Most of the literature would support up to 24-hour lifespan in terms of on hard surfaces like stainless steel or counterboards. Other surfaces such as cardboard or more porous surfaces, the duration of survival of the virus in that droplet is far shorter. And then lastly, animal contact. I mentioned that this likely started in bats. Well, the good news is there's not a lot of people who have bats as pets, at least not in my neighborhood. There are a lot of people who have dogs and cats. I'm a dog guy myself. And although this virus has been cultured from one dog that I know of in the United States, we know that that came from its human owners. And for cats, it's seen to been detected in tigers, in zoos, and in some household felines. But again, no evidence of animal to human spread in terms of domesticated pet spread, but more likely the pets got it from the owners. So wear your masks, right? All right, slide. All right, this is, I think, a good representation from Johns Hopkins University, a dashboard that a lot of people can log into, take a look at what the current disease rate is in the United States. And so right now, well, as of a little after noon today, there's over 1 million people in the United States who have confirmed to be infected with this virus, with over 61,000 deaths. Now, there are some biases in that data. We know that we don't have whole-scale, widely available testing across the United States. Some of the rhetoric given by leaders has been, look, if you are ill and you're not having difficulty breathing, you're not having a decreased pulse oximetry if you happen to have one of those at home, you don't have a high fever you can't get a hold of, if you can treat this symptomatically at home, stay home. Don't overburden an already overburdened medical system, right? Some of the issues there, though, are in certain segments of the population, people get sick fast. People go from not feeling well to needing ventilator support or supplemental oxygen rather quickly. So it is something that, although you can try and economize in terms of the requirement for hospitalization, good follow-up and frequent follow-up is very necessary. I mention that because for those who unfortunately may have passed at home or may have not gone into a hospital to be tested, we don't capture those numbers. So I would say likely the numbers you see in front of you are an underestimate of what actually is occurring. Do I have hard data on that? No, I just have common sense. And if you look in the lower right-hand portion, that's just a logarithmic smoothing of the current death rate. So as you can see, we all talk about flattening the curve, right? And when we take a look at this curve, it looks like we've had sort of two peaks, if you will, and now we seem to be starting to flatten that curve. The current recommendations are that for states to reopen or folks to get back to a new normal of doing business, we should see at least 2 weeks of decreasing numbers of new infections. The death rate will likely lag behind that infection rate. People become sick, they become ill, and for those unfortunate folks who do die, that occurs, it can occur, 2 to 3 weeks down the line. So that death rate will likely lag behind the passing of infection. Slide. A lot of questions about biosurveillance, and this is just a good snapshot of the biosurveillance cycle. And how are we dealing with this? How do we, know about what's going on? So if you look at the 3 o'clock on this cycle, that's the gathering of data, right? You're collecting data consistently. So for those who are looking for any potential sign of an outbreak, when you see a constellation of people becoming ill and you don't know why they're becoming ill, we're very fortunate now that we have gene sequencing available and we can detect novel infectious agents just like this coronavirus. And that was done in China, right? And then we take that data, we review it, and we integrate it, we analyze it. And then if you go up to about the 10 o'clock on this cycle, you turn that into actionable information that you can disseminate to key leaders and to people who can make a difference in what that information might mean. And then that decision gives support and feedback about where next to go for biosurveillance. So there's a national strategy for biosurveillance. It's been in place for many years. And it includes the Health and Human Services, the Center for Disease Control, Dr. Bob Redfield, the NIH, Dr. Francis Collins, and Dr. Anthony Fauci, and then BARDA with a new acting director. Department of Homeland Security has the National Biosurveillance Integration Center as part of its operations. The Department of Defense has global emerging infectious surveillance, of which I ran for a few years. And that's in over 71 countries globally, taking a look at what diseases might be raising their head, and what do we need to be worried about to inform our leadership, to inform those leaders as to what our next steps might be. There are other government agencies, both in the United States and even outside the United States, and ministries of health, ministries of defense, et cetera, who are all charged with participating in this biosurveillance cycle. And then there are other non-government organizations such as the Pasteur Institute, the Gates Foundation, and others, academia, and those centers that all participate and contribute to this biosurveillance life cycle that lets us know really what's going on. Next slide. So this is an outbreak response timeline, and it's overly simplified for those of you who do it for a living, I know. But I'd like to make sure that we hit the big spots. So an event is recognized. A sentinel event hits and the balloon goes up, right? And when that happens, surveillance studies are initiated. Now there's a difference between surveillance assays and diagnostic assays. And so for surveillance assays, we don't necessarily need to get the high level of rigor in terms of clinical decision-making that is required. What we want to know is, are we seeing a problem? Is it just a flash and bang? Or are we seeing a much larger firestorm occur? Those surveillance studies are initiated. These next three blue blocks, they start at the same time, but their deliveries happen almost sequentially. Diagnostics are developed. Without diagnostics, you're flying blind in the advent of an outbreak. So those are needed, and those are needed both from detecting the virus or pathogen, as well as immune responses, and we'll chat about that in a second. Therapeutics are developed, both small molecules and monoclonal and polyclonal antibodies, and those are developed to try and thwart active infection. So someone is admitted to your hospital, you have supportive care to offer them, but what other modalities of care and treatment can you yield that might shorten the disease lifespan or the need for higher levels of care, such as respiratory ventilation, or perhaps improve your survivability of this infection? And then vaccines are also developed. We say 18 months, right? 12 to 18 months for a vaccine to be developed and go through the regulatory hoops. I can tell you when we talk about all of these products being developed, the good relationships that we have with the regulatory agencies all working together to try and provide solutions to the point of care as quickly as possible, but also as safely as possible. There's a requirement to do this safely. You can't just identify a drug or a vaccine and say, hey, that sounds great, let's use it. You really have to collect the data and know what you're doing with that data and moving it forward. And that's why that green arrow down below of data collection, analysis, and reporting, this is a consistent theme throughout any outbreak. And we're well on the way to trying to understand more details about this virus, but we still have a lot to learn. Next slide. So in terms of the current healthcare initiatives to combat COVID-19, there are 41 diagnostic tests that have some sort of regulatory authorization, and that's important. These diagnostic tests that I mentioned here are those that identify virus. I'm not speaking to the antibody testing, but we will get there. The treatments, there are 23 currently that are in active clinical trials. And for vaccines, as of yesterday, there are 5 vaccines that are in at least phase 1 human clinical trials, and we're getting data from those in near real time. So that's the good news, right? Help is on the way rather quickly, comparatively. Next slide. So from a diagnostics, I mentioned that these are virus detection testing. So there's PCR, or polymerase chain reaction testing, point of care PCR, next generation sequencing, where we actually just sequence what is, if there is a virus, looking for that sequence and say, oh, I've identified that virus. And then isothermal amplification. I'm happy to give that lecture at the university at another time. And this is their approval status. There's 20 that the FDA has given emergency use authorization to so far. In Europe, that CE mark, there's 17. There's some lab developed tests. It's actually greater than 1 right now. And at least 3 of the tests that were touted have been discontinued. There are some tests out there that have been marketed both on the internet and elsewhere that are not approved. So if you get approached about giving your employees or yourselves or your families a test, and it's not an approved test, wave off, right? The result time from the time we draw the sample or have the sample, if it's a respiratory sample, until you have an answer is variable. It can be less than an hour. It can be 2 to 8 hours, or it can be greater than 12 hours. It depends on how those personnel are cohorted. Are they grouped together and you're testing samples on an every 4-hour run in a hospital? Or is someone coming into a local pharmacy or a point of care testing center waiting in their car while they get that result? And that result time is so very important as we try and thwart this disease. Next slide. From treatments, you'll see a breakdown of where they are in clinical development. We generally start at phase 1 and looking at preliminary safety and dosage, and then move it all the way up into phase 3 to look at effectiveness. And then there are 6 potential treatments that are specifically for these symptoms, 12 that are anti-inflammatory, because just like we mentioned in that respiratory infection in 1918, this infectious process does develop somewhat of a cytokine storm as well. And then 5 of these products are geared towards antiviral growth. And some good news coming out of some of those products now. Slide. Vaccines, well, this is my sweet spot, right? There are 41 that are currently in early development. I mentioned that 5 of the vaccines are in the clinic right now. There are DNA-based vaccines and messenger RNA or RNA-based vaccines. And these vaccines involve injections, either intramuscularly or subdermally. And then, generally speaking, some electroporation, just a fancy name for a little bit of electrical stimulus on the skin to drive that DNA or mRNA into our dendritic cells and get a robust immune response. More traditional vaccine production methodologies, either protein subunit vaccines with or without an adjuvant, replicating viral vector vaccines and virus-like particles that self-adjuvant, non-replicating viral vectors and live attenuated virus. The inactivated virus, think of that like your traditional flu vaccine where we grow up a bunch of virus, we kill it, and then we give you a little taste of that, your immune system a little taste of that virus. And your immune system develops a robust response to that and realizes that's the wanted poster for your immune system. The majority of these, the DNAs, the protein subunits, the other VLPs, they are all, for the most part, acting against that glycoprotein spike on the coronavirus that I showed you in that yellow arrow a little earlier. But these are the vaccines moving forward. I can tell you there's good news on the horizon in terms of these platforms have already been developed for other coronaviruses. So the good news was they were able to turn the key on the machine and go very quickly with a safe product into phase 1 testing. And we look forward to those results, be it in May or June, to fast forward us into a safe but good phase 2 studies, where we can then take a look in phase 2 and 3 of some preliminary efficacy of these vaccines and what they might do to someone. And then the last slide, these are the references that I mentioned. If you have a want, and these will be sent to you from the PBC, I would recommend just playing around with some of these reference points. They'll give you good information, consistent information, and I highly recommend them. And with that, Tim, I'll turn it back to you, and I'll open it up for questions.
Awesome, Jim. Thanks very much for that presentation and for sharing your insights. One of the first questions, we had some questions come in during the registration process, and sticking along the line of the vaccine and developing a vaccine. Can you talk a little bit about how you're tracking and studying the different mutations of this virus as you try to figure out a vaccine that will be helpful?
Sure. So right now, as aliquots or infectious samples are identified, they are being sent to main labs such as the CDC's lab. The state labs also collect these. And through the advent of novel technologies like gene sequencing, we're able to see from a genetic tree where the mutations are occurring and how that might affect both the disease progression as well as immunity, right? The good news is, although there's been really almost 2 variants, an L and an S of these strains seen from its being first noticed in China, the vaccine constructs that we're seeing come out right now, as well as the products that are seen, monoclonal or polyclonal antibody methodologies, are really going to still be able to cover these slight mutations. That said, the one thing that's constant is change. So we're continuing to review these changes to ensure that the solutions that we're bringing forward will still cover immunologically or otherwise these viruses in light of their changes. Next question.
Great. Can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing relative to the FDA and kind of the cooperation that's happening between some of the pharmaceutical companies as well as the government trying to work together on a vaccine for the virus?
Yeah, I sure will. I'll tell you, there's been in my short career, 26 years or so, there's been a great development or maturation, I think, of relationships with the FDA and other regulatory agencies and industry, right? And that there's partnerships for developing solutions moving forward. So where at one point in time, the FDA or other regulatory agencies may not have been looked at as a facilitator of great products moving forward, but more of a policeman, right? Now what's happening is the FDA is really bringing to bear the full might of their knowledge and their power as a regulatory agency that has seen so much in their history to ensure that we're very rapidly assessing these investigational new drugs or vaccines or diagnostics and facilitating great work moving forward faster. The regulatory process has really sped up in terms of the total amount of time that it requires to take a good look to ensure a safe product is moving forward. And that's key. You don't want a rubber stamp, and that's not what they're giving. They're giving very thoughtful review, but in a more expedited fashion. And I think that on the industry side, industry is being a bit more accommodating in terms of now understanding through the series of years of these relationships what can and can't be facilitated or assisted with through these agencies. So no one's looking for shortcuts, right? But we are looking for is an acceleration of that development plan, and I think that's what's occurring right now with the FDA and with other regulatory groups in Europe and elsewhere.
Great, and as you can imagine, both early registration as well as in the Q&A right now, a number of questions. So we'll try to summarize this together. Is again, when it will normal be back, if you will, right? So when can we kind of think about opening things? Will students be back on campus in the fall? Can you talk a little bit about some of the, again, without giving the personnel in the room, but maybe the experience that you've had being in a room with some government leaders, governors, mayors, and the decision that's being made relative to when to open up, as well as individuals like yourself who have the expertise to talk a little bit about the science and what's going on in that process.
Thanks, Tim. So from that standpoint, it's a very fluid situation. I think others have made it very clear. This isn't a light switch that we flip on to say, okay, we're open for business now, let's go, right? This is going to be a very segmented transition. And when you say getting back to normal, it's a new normal, guys. What we're looking for, I think, over the summer is continuing the social distancing. We'll see what the guidance is in terms of facial coverings or masks in the workplace. But I think the social distancing in workplace will still need to happen when those non-essential, but so very important jobs are brought back online, right? I think that from educator standpoints, there's so much value in having people together for either the collegiate or, in my case, the grade school experience, that you really want kids to have that socialization and that process of further maturation and development, but it can't be at the cost of endangering their health. So I think we have to be very practical and pragmatic. I think the current guidelines set out by the CDC and others in government of seeing at least a 2-week decline in the overall infection rates in general and specific areas prior to opening make the most sense to me scientifically. And I think we do so cautiously. I'm a fan of the build, measure, learn cycle. So we'll take a look, we'll make a very data-driven decision, and then we will monitor to see what that decision produced. if it looks like we're on the upward spike of another high infection rate, then I think we have to retract back a little. No one wants to be the one who opened too early, or I think not a lot of people do, and caused an increase in the death rate, right? So I think folks are using data. There's an island off the coast of Japan that was one of the first to identify the high risks of COVID-19 virus, or SARS-CoV-2, and they took what was considered at the time very draconian measures of keeping people sheltering in place and in home, and but then they opened, and they might have opened a little too early, and the disease came back with a vengeance. And their provincial minister of health has hung his head and said, you know, my largest mistake was we opened too early. So I think there's a lot of caution to the wind, and if you're going to err, I think likely you would err on the side of being a bit too cautious, knowing that there's so much hanging in the balance, right? A socialization for our children, of jobs for the economy. It is a tough decision, but it needs to be a data-driven decision. So as this unfolds, given those parameters, you know, I look forward to getting back to what I call a new normal, and again, seeing the process develop. Next question.
Continuing that theme of the data and then some international perspective, some of the countries are seeing higher death rates maybe than the US, or the US is seeing higher death rates than some other countries. Do you have a sense of why that may be, or maybe some of the responses that you're seeing in some of these other countries that may have an impact on those numbers?
Sure. Well, I think a couple things. Our early action to social distancing, it's working, right? Having people stay at home, it's working, right? And so all that's doing is slowing the spread of this virus. That's also helping our healthcare facilities not become overwhelmed, making sure that there's enough ventilators out there for everybody, making sure that we're somewhat slowing down the clock so that we can have our diagnostics and then therapeutics and vaccines catch up with us, right? I think that there's been some recent data looking at getting 5 million diagnostics tests, you know, a certain period of time as a requirement for, you know, a country the size of the United States to be able to adequately reinforce disease detection should an additional spike or outbreak occur. I think that data is from a Harvard study that was put out last week. So there's definitely some parameters out there for what is needed, or what we have at our disposal, our armamentarium, for providing, I think, sort of a grasp on trying to control the mortality rate with this outbreak. And again, we have a very resource-rich country, although, right, here in the great United States, we still don't have enough N95 masks, right? We don't have enough personal protective equipment for many of our healthcare workers. And so I think as we're catching up, capacity is catching up for just that. I think we're making some good headway on ventilator support. So as far as I know, there's not been that terrible decision that had to be made, or would have to be made, where there wasn't enough ventilators and someone had to die, right? So from that standpoint, from resources, the United States is way ahead of some other countries that unfortunately either didn't put these parameters in place earlier, or didn't have the capacity in their healthcare system to absorb it. And if you don't have that capacity when everyone's sick, you're going to see a higher mortality rate. The other thing is, I think that our disease rate is likely, as I mentioned in that Johns Hopkins slide, our disease rate is likely a little higher. There's some reporting bias in both the disease rate and the mortality rate, but I think that the measures that have been put in place have certainly helped flatten that curve, if that's not a cliche term already. Go ahead, Tim, next question.
All right, there's several questions, and I'm going to give your former science professor, Dr. Michael Hardisky, the credit on this one. What is your opinion on the efficacy of, what is it, remdesivir, right, as a treatment?
Yep, remdesivir. So for those of you who are familiar with it or may not be, that was a drug that was first developed as a potential solution for the Ebola virus outbreak. It's by a company called Gilead. And there's been some good results, good data in US studies, I think, showing that it's somewhat positive in terms of shortening the duration of illness in the hospital. I think some of the initial data showed it decreased from placebo control, a 15-day average admission to a 12-day admission. That decreases the strain on our healthcare system, but it also gets folks out there, lessens the impact that that infection has on them overall. So I'm heartened by that initial data. I will have to say I haven't seen the full analysis. There was a similar such study that was stopped in China, and that was because they started having a waning of cases. They didn't have enough cases in hospital to give them the statistical power that would be required to show value of that drug. And even the primary investigators in China said they thought that this test article warranted further consideration and further testing. So I am bolstered by the initial responses we have seen with that product, and I look forward to more data to come. And thank you, Dr. Hrdisky. You're one of the reasons why I'm here tonight. Next question.
Jim, can you talk a little bit about the solutions you've seen in the past, right? The coming out of pandemics, and how you see where we're at and what may go in the future, right? Like what happened after Ebola, what happened after SARS, what happened after the 1918 flu, right? Are we
Sure.
on a similar path of hopefully correction?
Right. So we learn each time these things come up. And as I said, the next one, it's coming. It's not if, it's when. You don't need to stockpile more toilet paper, but I think that it's just a matter of time before the next outbreak occurs, right? Now that said, you know, some of the solutions that we dialed in for Ebola and for Zika, we're actually implementing today, right? So a very traditional medical methodology of collecting plasma and using that plasma or sera to provide antibody responses of people who have previously been infected with COVID-19 and now have antibodies circulating that can then be transplanted or given to someone who is ill. Makes a lot of sense from a scientific and medical standpoint. And the FDA agreed, said, no, this is more of a traditional therapeutic methodology, and we should be looking at that. But for goodness sakes, let's collect the data. Like anything else, I think we've learned during these outbreaks that although outbreaks happen and there's a lot of potential good solutions out there, you have to collect the data to know if what you're doing is working or, God forbid, is actually negatively impacting your population. So the data collection, I think, Tim, has gotten a lot better. I think the scientific methodologies of gene sequencing, of tracking the variations or mutations in the virus or whatever the pathogen might be is very helpful. And then I think also taking a look at good basic preventive medicine, you know, ensuring that people wash their hands, right? Ensuring that people wear a mask and social distance. That saved lives, right? That seems simple, but look how effective that has been. Is that a long-term, lifelong solution? No. We're going to put in place those vaccines and other things that we can, but in the meantime, let's use the tools that we have in the toolbox. You know, one of the testings that I didn't go into great detail about, and I'm just realizing that now, in terms of these antibody levels, right? I think I've gotten 2 or 3 questions about that a day, and probably several emails from well-meaning diagnostic labs offering to test me and my family for antibody levels for COVID-19. And there are some antibody tests that are currently approved by the FDA. I think there's 4 of them out there right now. But I guess my answer is, what are you going to do with that data? We don't yet know with this infection what a protective antibody level is. So if I don't know what that data means, what am I going to do with that information? So there's been, I think, some efforts by some to say, well, I can screen your workforce and tell you who has antibody levels for past infection and who doesn't. Again, I challenge that with, what does that mean? I don't know. The NIH doesn't know. World Health Organization doesn't know. So I think if anyone is seeing a lot of data or a poll, if you will, to try and get their antibody levels tested, I would caution them, let's make sure there's good data to act on that information. And that's what I'm doing with myself and my family before we would go down that lane. Next question, Tim.
You have time for maybe just a couple more?
I'm here as long as you need me. Go ahead.
Okay, someone asked if you could talk a little bit about is it the cytokine storm effect with the virus?
Sure, the cytokine storm. So an immune system's good, right? And you know, that's part of my bread and butter. My business is vaccines that leverage the immune system to thwart these viruses. The problem becomes with certain infections, and certainly in the case of this virus and others, it can trick the body into having an overwhelming immune response. So the body not just does not see an invading virus, but may misidentify other body cells that have been either infected with the virus or near the virus, and it will attack the self. So in essence, in a respiratory infection, it's not just those alveolar cells that have become infected with the virus and are now being beat up by our immune system. Your immune system gets a little out of itself, gets over its skis, and starts destroying what would be healthy cells. And now you have someone who is in respiratory compromise because they have a respiratory infection, but then the cells they're using, the pulmonary cells they're using for oxygen diffusion and oxygenating the blood, which is one of the good uses of the lung, it's no longer being able to be done because that cytokine storm has caused either cellular destruction or also an oozing of fluid in the cytokine responses. It's almost like drowning from the inside out. So in some ways, some of the medications that are being tested, specifically remdesivir, some of those testings also use an anti-inflammatory drug alongside to thwart, if you will, that cytokine storm. More to follow in terms of what those anti-inflammatory meds will mean in terms of an overall treatment response. But I think trying to slow down an immune system that has started a raging fire in the body is probably a good thing.
Great. And obviously this is not going to be the last virus, right, or the last pandemic we face. So as someone who's kind of right on the front lines relative to looking at the data, trying to find the determination to get us out of this, what are we learning now? What are some of the lessons we're learning that can help us not only with this, but get ready for whatever the next COVID number is?
Sure. And I look at this, it's something we commonly see in academia, in government, and in the commercial sector. It's lessons learned and forgotten, right? So right now, everybody's hot like fire about COVID-19. And that's great, and it's getting a lot of funding, and it's getting a lot of attention, right? But I mentioned biosurveillance. That's your soldier on the wall, right? That's your sentinel of telling you there's an issue out there. And then diagnostics. We have to invest in both of those to determine what infections or reemerging infections are occurring so that then we can react to them. We have to share that information or that data in terms of processing it into actionable information. So of the slides I've shown you this evening, that Hopkins slide is pretty slick, right? They have a dashboard that shows you everything that's going on. But here's the deal. They didn't just whip that up overnight, right? They've been working on things of that nature and that ilk because of some consistent funding. So funding has to occur for these baseline biosurveillance projects, these disease detection units, and then also development of platforms for vaccines, for therapeutics, and for diagnostics. All three of those things are so very important in terms of maintaining a very much a ready posture in terms of going after what is the next outbreak. And then the other piece is building those relationships and reinforcing them with industry, with the regulatory groups, so that people are more open to sharing that information. Having those touch points in place only makes it easier in time of trouble to know that we can all come together collectively, as we're doing now and as we did for the SARS outbreak and the Ebola outbreak. We can come together as a global community really to bring solutions to bear.
About maybe one or two more. Someone asks, with Dr. Fauci, Governor Newsom, Governor Cuomo, all being Jesuit educated, and we'll add in Jim Cummings to that group. Should we have more Jesuit educated folks in position of leadership in situations like this?
One, absolutely yes. And two, I think I covered that by saying we need to invest, right? And so I think that a strong, well-balanced education, a Jesuit education, being a person for others, certainly that was that baseline was hammered home to me at the university and throughout my career. And I think we're all going to have an opportunity to support funding that Jesuit education coming up on the 6th of May, and in other forms, whether it's, and I'll tell you, whether it's sharing your intellectual capabilities, as I'm happy to do, your spiritual wealth, or your financial wealth. However you can support, I think, Jesuit education moving forward, I think it's important that everybody has a stake in the game and everyone can contribute in their own way.
Well, that's awesome, Jim. Well said. And I think we're going to close on that note. It's hard to top that. Can't tell you how much I appreciate you spending the time with us, sharing your expertise, not only tonight, but for all that you do in support of the University of Scranton. On behalf of us, let me just give you a little round of applause for the group. And I thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Father. And hey, everyone out there, please wash your hands. Good night.
Thank you. As we close our webinar, I want to thank Frank Pern, Father Pilars, my colleagues, Sarah Efforts, who helped us go through our webinar, get ready for this, and help guide us in the process. I also want to thank our colleagues in the university's IT department, specifically Jason Wimmer and Jason Oki, who provided the technical guidance and expertise to make this happen. All of us who are working from home, like many of you in your own companies and organizations, we at the university are truly grateful for the entire IT team who's on call 24/7 to be sure that all aspects of the University of Scranton continue to remain and run smoothly in our current virtual world. Thank you all for attending. We look forward to seeing you at our future PBC webinars. And until then, please stay safe. We will now shut down our presenters' videos and microphones and leave our thank you slide up. Leave the meeting button, please, at the bottom of the screen. Thank you very much and have a good night.